On a warm October night in 1996, the Whitaker family vanished from their home on Sycamore Lane. Dinner was left on the table. The front door stood ajar. Their dog, restless and hungry, circled the living room. But the family of four, parents, two children, was never seen again. What happened inside that house has baffled investigators for decades. Tonight, we return to Sycamore Lane. If you're fascinated by unsolved mysteries, forgotten crimes, and the chilling stories buried in America's quiet suburbs, subscribe. October 12th, 1996. The neighborhood was still. Streetlights glowed dimly against the crisp autumn air, their cones of light spilling onto cracked sidewalks. Inside 147 Sycamore Lane, a faint glow came from the kitchen window. A plate of chicken sat cooling on the table. A carton of milk, uncapped, sweated condensation. The faint sound of a radio talk show hummed from the corner. But the chairs were empty. The hallway upstairs held traces of life. The hum of an electric toothbrush left running. A closet door half open, with coats swinging gently, as though moved by an unseen hand. In the living room, the television played a late-night comedy rerun. To no audience. The Whitaker's Labrador, Penny, pawed at the back door, whining, nails scraping the wood. Hours later, when a neighbor finally grew uneasy and entered through the front, Penny bolted into the night. The police arrived just after midnight. They found no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no overturned furniture, just absence. Every clock ticked on, as though nothing had happened. Every trace of life lingered, except the lives themselves. Within weeks, the Whitakers were declared missing persons. Within months, the case ran cold. Within years, their disappearance became the kind of whispered story passed between teenagers daring each other to walk down Sycamore Lane at night. And then, 2 decades later, something resurfaced. By 2018, the Whitaker home had long since been sold, then sold again. Families came and went, most staying only a year or two. Realtors would polish the story, never lying, never telling the whole truth. Charming colonial style. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths. They would not mention the Whitakers. Not at first. Detective Laura Myers, now retired, still remembered the call that night in 1996. She had been 32 then, sharp-eyed, ambitious, certain she could crack any case, with patience and persistence. Sycamore Lane had humbled her. It was a cold February morning when she returned to the house for the first time in years. The new owner, a middle-aged woman named Cynthia Rollins, had called her in hushed panic. "There's something in the basement," Cynthia had said. "I think it's connected to them." Laura parked across the street, stepping out into the brittle air. The house looked unchanged. White siding, navy shutters, the same maple tree out front, bare branches scratching at the sky. But time had dulled it. Paint peeled around the window frames. The shutters sagged. A for sale sign leaned tiredly in the yard. Inside, Cynthia led her down the narrow hallway to the basement door. The hinges creaked. A wave of cool dampness rolled upward. "I was cleaning," Cynthia whispered, clutching her cardigan tighter. "I moved the shelving and saw this." Laura descended slowly. The basement smelled of dust and soil. Against the far wall, behind a rack of paint cans and old holiday decorations, something jutted from the concrete. A small rust-colored stain where the wall met the floor. At first glance, it could have been rust from a leaky pipe, but Laura knelt down, ran a gloved finger along the mark, and felt the faint grit of dried residue. Old. Too dark for rust. Blood. Cynthia's breathing hitched behind her. "I knew it. Everyone says this place is haunted, but it's not. It's cursed. Someone did something terrible here. Laura said nothing. Memories pressed against her chest. The first night, the empty plates, the dog whining at the door. The house had felt wrong then too, not haunted, but hollowed. She stood, brushing dust from her knees. We'll need to test it. Get a sample. Cynthia clasped her hands together. Do you think it's theirs? Laura didn't answer. That night, as she drove home, she couldn't stop replaying the image of the stain, blood in the foundation, as if the house itself had absorbed what happened here. Back in 1996, they had searched every inch, closets, crawl spaces, attic beams. Nothing. No struggle, no forced entry, no fingerprints out of place. It had been the most orderly disappearance she'd ever seen. Now, 22 years later, the house was still whispering secrets. Laura pulled out her old case files from storage. The box was battered, the tabs yellowed. Inside were photographs, black and white prints of the Whitaker family, smiling on their front lawn. Crime scene photos of the empty kitchen table. A map of Sycamore Lane with highlighted routes. The father, Daniel, 42. The mother, Ellen, 39. The children, Sarah, 15, and Michael, 12. Normal in every sense. Church on Sundays. Daniel worked in insurance. Ellen part-time at the library. Theories had swirled for years. Cult abduction, witness protection relocation, murder-suicide, staged as disappearance, but not fit. Laura stared at Sarah's school photo. The girl's wide smile framed by braces, eyes bright, with the unself-conscious confidence of 15. Gone. The blood sample was sent to the lab. Laura made calls, old favors. Within days, the results came back. Degraded, partial, but human. Too damaged to yield a clean profile, but enough to confirm what she already felt. The Whitaker home had seen violence. She found herself driving to Sycamore Lane again, parking under the shadow of the maple tree. The house was dark, empty now. Cynthia had moved out, leaving the for sale sign behind. Laura stood at the curb, staring at the windows. Neighbors' blinds twitched. People still watched that house, still whispered. She thought of the stain in the basement and the silence in the house that night long ago. Something had happened here, and maybe, just maybe, it wasn't finished telling its story. The morning of October 12, 1996, had been ordinary by every account. Ellen Whitaker dropped by the library for her Saturday shift. Daniel stopped at the corner store for cigarettes and a newspaper. Sarah spent the afternoon at a friend's house, working on a school project, while Michael played basketball in the driveway. Ordinary. Laura knew that in true crime, ordinary was a mirage. Something always moved beneath the surface. She began with the neighbors. It was late afternoon when she pulled into Sycamore Lane again, her notebook resting on the passenger seat. The houses here all looked the same. Modest two-story colonials, with clipped lawns, shutters, and fading pastels. The kind of neighborhood built for comfort and anonymity. Mrs. Jacobs answered first. She had been in her 40s back in '96. Now her hair was white and her back bent, but her eyes still carried sharpness. She opened her door only a crack. "I already told the police everything," she said. "I know," Laura replied gently. "But time changes what we remember. I'm not here officially, just trying to understand." After a pause, Mrs. Jacobs let her in. The living room smelled of lavender polish. Family photos lined the mantel, children, then grandchildren. "They were good people," Mrs. Jacobs said, lowering herself into a chair. "That night, I remember hearing Penny barking. Not unusual. She always barked when she wanted out. But it went on for hours. I almost called, but..." Her lips pressed thin. "Well, I didn't want to be the nosy neighbor." Did you hear anything else? Laura asked. Mrs. Jacobs stared into her lap. Voices? Not shouting, just murmurs, like someone having a conversation in low tones. I assumed Daniel was up late, Laura wrote quickly. What time? Around 11. Maybe later. And then, she hesitated. I thought I heard the front door slam. But when I looked, it was quiet again. Just the house sitting there, Laura nodded. The detail hadn't been in the original report. Back then, most neighbors had claimed to see nothing unusual. But whispers at 11 p.m., that mattered. Next, she visited Mr. Holbrook, who lived directly across the street. He was a retired mail carrier now, his porch cluttered with wind chimes that sang in the breeze. I saw the lights on, he told her, squinting at her with watery eyes. Kitchen light, living room light. Around 10:30, I think, huh? Then nothing. Like someone flipped a switch. Nothing unusual during the day. Daniel waved when he got the mail. Kids rode their bikes up and down. Ellen said hello from the garden. Nothing strange. Not until that night Laura thanked him, jotting down notes. She could feel the story knitting together in fragments. Pennies barking, low voices, lights extinguished too suddenly. But it was Mrs. Adams, 3 houses down, who said something that made Laura's hand still on the page. I heard a car, she said firmly. Sometime past midnight. Engine idling. Not one of theirs. I knew the sound of Daniel's sedan. This one was rougher, like an old truck. Sat there a while, then drove off. I told the police at the time, but they brushed me off. Said maybe it was a neighbor's visitor. Laura's pulse quickened. She had combed the reports countless times, yet the note about a truck had been buried beneath my reliable leads. What direction? She asked. Mrs. Adams pointed toward the back of the subdivision. Headed out toward Old Mill Road. I remember because the headlights swept across my curtains. An old truck idling on the very night the Whitakers vanished. That evening, Laura returned home and spread the files across her dining table. The photographs stared back at her. The empty kitchen, the unmade beds, the family smiling before it all. She added her new notes. Voices around 11 p.m. Door slam. Lights off by 10:30 to 11. Truck idling past midnight. She pinned the details to a timeline. The gap troubled her. If the Whitakers were home by evening, what had pulled them away from their table? Their routines. She remembered something Ellen's sister had once said in an interview. Ellen wasn't afraid of strangers, but she was careful. If she opened that door late at night, it was because she knew the person on the other side. Laura leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Someone familiar. Someone they trusted enough to let inside. The next day, she requested the old case recordings from the station's archives. Hours of grainy VHS tapes, interviews, press conferences, neighborhood canvassing. One clip caught her eye. October 14th, 1996. Reporters crowded outside the Whitaker home. A detective at the time assured the press that every possible lead is being pursued. And in the background, among the neighbors gathered, Laura saw a man she didn't recognize, standing still, hands shoved in his pockets, eyes fixed on the house. She froze the tape, zoomed. The image blurred, but his posture carried a peculiar tension, as if he knew something the others did not. Laura scribbled a note. Unidentified male, dark jacket, Sycamore Lane crowd. That night, she dreamt of the Whitaker kitchen, the chicken still cooling, Penny scratching the door. Only in the dream, she saw shadows moving against the window, tall, indistinct shapes, standing too close to the glass. She woke with her heart pounding. The dream lingered like smoke. There were pieces missing, she knew. But the house, the neighbors, the truck, these were threads. Threads she could still follow. And 22 years of silence did not erase the truth. The city archives smelled of dust and cardboard. Rows of gray boxes stretched endlessly, each labeled with faded case numbers. Laura signed in, under her old badge number, though she no longer had authority here. The clerk at the desk, a young man with headphones dangling from his ears, barely glanced at her. Box 96-341, Laura said. Whitaker disappearance. He wheeled it out. Half an hour later. The box sagged under the weight of binders, tapes, loose papers. She carried it to a table in the corner, heart tightening with familiarity. The files were as she remembered, witness statements typed in courier font, Polaroids of the house, reports stamped inconclusive. But deeper in the stack, she found documents she had not seen before. Perhaps she had overlooked them then. Perhaps they had been misfiled. One was a property survey of the Whitaker lot, dated 2 months before the disappearance. A note scrawled in the margin, unauthorized excavation, reported near back fence. See follow-up. Laura frowned. She flipped pages until she found the follow-up. A brief line. Responding officer observed disturbed soil behind shed. No further action taken. Disturbed soil. 2 months before they vanished. And no one had followed up. She copied the report into her notebook, her pulse quickening. By afternoon, she drove back to Sycamore Lane. The maple tree swayed overhead, its branches bare. The Whitakers' old backyard lay quiet, overgrown with weeds. She crossed to the fence, boots crunching over brittle leaves. Behind the shed, the soil was hard, uneven. She knelt, brushing aside debris. A shallow depression, faint but distinct, remained etched in the earth. Her gloved hand pressed into the dirt. For an instant, she imagined the weight of a shovel striking down, the muffled thud of earth shifting. She stood quickly, the back of her neck prickling. The wind rattled through the trees, like whispered voices. That evening, Laura drove to the university's criminology library, where she knew the microfilm archives were better maintained. She loaded reels into the old machine, scrolling through newspapers from October 1996. Headlines screamed of the disappearance. Family of 4 vanishes without a trace. Neighbors stunned by mystery on Sycamore Lane. But in the local section, buried deep, she found another article from August of that year. Whitaker family reports vandalism. No suspects. The piece was short, just a few sentences. Someone had spray-painted words on their garage door. Liars, thieves. Police dismissed it as a prank. Laura leaned back, frowning. This was not in the case file. Or, if it had been, it was buried under more sensational leads. Someone had targeted the Whitakers months before they vanished. She sought out Ellen's younger sister, Marianne. The woman lived in a retirement community now, her once dark hair gone silver. They were good people, Marianne insisted, stirring sugar into her tea. Daniel worked too much, sure. But who didn't? Ellen loved the kids more than anything. Did they have enemies? Laura asked. Marianne's spoon paused mid-stir. Well, Daniel wasn't perfect. He invested with some shady people, lost money. There were arguments. Ellen called me once, crying, saying he was in trouble. But she never gave details. She didn't want to worry me. What kind of trouble? Marianne hesitated. She said someone was watching the house. Said Daniel swore it would blow over. But she sounded scared. Laura's pen hovered over her notebook. What month was this? Late summer. Maybe August. The same time the vandalism appeared. The same time the soil behind the shed was disturbed. Marianne pressed the spoon down hard on the saucer. She wanted to move. Said Sycamore Lane didn't feel safe anymore. Daniel refused. He said moving would make them look guilty. Guilty of what? Marianne shook her head. I never knew. Ellen wouldn't say. And then, they were gone. That night, Laura spread her findings across her table. Soil disturbed, threatening graffiti, financial entanglements, a family afraid. The clean disappearance no longer looked so clean. She returned to the VHS tape she had frozen earlier. The press conference with the man in the crowd. She studied his posture, his hands shoved deep in pockets. For the first time, she noticed something on his wrist. A band of ink. A tattoo. Blurred but visible even in the poor footage. A ring of dark lines circling his arm. She replayed the clip again and again. The tattoo was crude, thick, almost like prison ink. Laura flipped back through her notes. Daniel Whitaker had worked in insurance, but before that, briefly in construction. His co-workers, unknown. His debts, possibly to people who did not forget. A man with a tattoo. A truck idling after midnight. Soil disturbed behind the shed. She sat back, exhaustion pulling at her. But her mind would not rest. The Whitakers had not simply vanished. They had been erased. Piece by piece, Laura could see it now. Someone had wanted them gone long before October 12th. And 22 years later, those shadows were still standing at the window. The basement stain results came back inconclusive. Human blood. Degraded beyond proper analysis. No match possible. Oh. Laura sat in her car staring at the report. Forensics had advanced so far in 2 decades, yet time still erased. The house had waited too long to give up its secrets. But the file gave her an excuse to visit someone she hadn't seen in years. Detective Mark Delaney had been her partner on the case back in '96. He was retired now, grayer, heavier, but his handshake still had the firmness of a man who didn't let go easily. They met at a diner just outside town, a place that smelled of fried onions and stale coffee. The same booth they had once shared for late-night strategy sessions. "You look tired," Delaney said, sliding into the seat. "I am," Laura admitted. "I've been looking at Sycamore Lane again." Delaney's brows rose. "That case?" He shook his head. "You know it's a dead end." "Not if there are things we missed," Laura countered. She pushed the stain report across the table. Blood in the basement wall. Never logged. Delaney leaned forward, scanning the page. His jaw tightened. "We searched that house top to bottom. If there was blood, it should have been in the file. It wasn't. And neither was the vandalism, or the disturbed soil behind the shed." He sighed, running a hand over his face. "We were stretched thin, Laura. Missing persons, runaway teens, half the city on meth. Things fell through cracks. Things," she repeated softly, "like a family of 4. Delaney looked at her, his eyes shadowed. "You think someone covered it up?" "I think someone wanted us looking in the wrong direction." After the diner, Delaney surprised her. "You want to see the evidence room?" he asked. It was late evening when they drove to the precinct. The evidence archive was in the basement, a fluorescent-lit maze of shelves stacked with boxes. "Technically, I shouldn't let you in," Delaney muttered, swiping his old card. "But I figure if anyone deserves another look, it's you." The Whitaker box sat on the middle shelf, thick with dust. Laura pulled it down carefully, heart pounding. Inside were the items she remembered: Sarah's school notebooks, Michael's basketball jersey, a stack of photographs. But beneath them lay a smaller envelope she didn't recall. It was unmarked, sealed. Laura glanced at Delaney. He shrugged. "Open it." She tore the flap carefully. Inside was a plastic bag containing a piece of fabric, blue, frayed along the edges, stiff with age. She held it up to the light. A patch of denim, perhaps from jeans. Along one seam, faint smears of what looked like dried blood. "Where did this come from?" she asked. Delaney shook his head. "I don't remember seeing that. Not once. There was no tag, no log sheet. just the fabric, sealed and forgotten. Laura's throat tightened. The bag was dated October 15th, 1996, 3 days after the Whitakers vanished. The initials of the officer who collected it were barely legible. "Where was this found?" she pressed. Delaney flipped the envelope over. A faint scrawl. "Old Mill Road, 1.2 miles from residence." Laura felt the room tilt slightly. Old Mill Road, the same direction the truck had driven that night. She sealed the bag again, her hands shaking. Why wasn't this tested? Delaney's voice was low. Maybe it was. Maybe they didn't like the result. That night, Laura couldn't sleep. She spread the files across her living room, photographs and reports, forming a mosaic of absence. The denim scrap lay in the center. She couldn't take her eyes off it. Sarah had loved jeans, ripped, faded, scribbled with pen. Ellen hated them, said they looked sloppy. Sarah wore them anyway. Was this hers? Laura imagined Sarah running, falling, scraping against gravel, blood-soaking denim, a truck idling nearby. The clock ticked past midnight. Laura rose, poured herself a glass of water, stared out at the dark street. For the first time in years, she felt the case breathing again, like something buried was shifting, rising to the surface. And she was afraid of what it might reveal. Old Mill Road hadn't changed much in 24 years. A cracked ribbon of asphalt, winding through trees that leaned too close, their branches arching like ribs over a spine. The woods were thick, dark even in the daylight. Laura parked at the shoulder where the evidence envelope had marked. The October air bit cold through her jacket, carrying the smell of damp leaves and earth. She walked slowly along the tree line, scanning the ditch, the roots, the way the ground dipped. A crow cawed overhead, the sound ragged like warning. The scrap of denim had been logged here, but there was nothing now, just tangled underbrush and a silence that felt too deliberate. She crouched, brushing aside dead leaves. Gravel poked through the soil. And then her hand stilled. A small depression, circular, almost perfectly round, too neat for nature. She returned the next day with Delaney. "You think something's here?" he asked, skeptical. But he brought a spade. They dug carefully. The soil was compact, stubborn, but 2 feet down the earth changed, looser, mixed with grit and small shards of rusted metal. Delaney froze, holding up a bent license plate corner. The paint was long faded, but the stamped number was visible, 27K-. Laura's chest tightened. "That matches the Whitakers' minivan," she whispered. They kept digging. Another piece surfaced, a broken headlight rim, shattered glass clinging to it. Then something softer, half decayed, the remains of upholstery foam, weathered but unmistakable. Delaney swore under his breath. They buried the damn van. They called in a forensic team. By dusk, the clearing buzzed with lights, generators, and the hum of excavation equipment. The forest's silence was shattered by the grind of machinery clawing into the soil. Piece by piece, the skeleton of a vehicle emerged. A crushed frame, skeletal tires, rusted steel bones. Laura stood back, her breath coming in shallow bursts. This was their car. The Whitakers hadn't just vanished. They had been driven here, and their vehicle entombed in the earth, like a secret meant never to resurface. But there were no bodies inside. The seats were ripped out. The trunk was empty, every compartment gutted. As the last panel was pried open, Laura stepped closer. A foul odor seeped from the rusted shell, sweet, rancid, clinging to her nostrils. She covered her mouth. "Blood," she whispered. The forensic tech nodded grimly. "A lot of it. We'll run tests." The media descended within hours. Helicopters thudded overhead, reporters swarming the road with cameras. Delaney leaned against his car, smoking, the lines in his face carved deeper by the glow of floodlights. "This is going to explode," he muttered. Laura didn't answer. She couldn't stop staring at the van, its hollow frame gaping like a ribcage. Something else bothered her. The burial site wasn't random. It was too precise. The soil packed evenly, the covering uniform. Whoever did this had taken time. And that meant planning, intention. This wasn't a panicked crime. This was calculated. When she returned home, Laura replayed the discovery over and over. She pinned the license plate fragment to her board, beside the denim scrap. Evidence was finally surfacing, clawing its way back into the light, after decades. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone already knew this day would come. That whoever buried the van hadn't made a mistake. They had left a grave to be found. By morning, the story was everywhere. Family van's remains, found after 24 years. Helicopter footage showed the rusted frame being hauled from the ground, like the bones of a whale dragged from the deep. Anchors whispered about a gruesome discovery and renewed hope for answers. For Laura, it wasn't hope. It was dread. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Journalists, old contacts, even strangers who claimed to know something. Everyone wanted a piece of Sycamore Lane. She ignored them all. Instead, she drove back to the neighborhood where it had started. Sycamore Lane hadn't changed much. Modest homes with sagging porches, rusting mailboxes, overgrown hedges. A cul-de-sac, frozen in the 1990s, as if the world had stopped moving, the night the Whitakers disappeared. Most of the original neighbors were gone, but some had stayed, people who couldn't or wouldn't leave. Laura started with Mrs. Gibbons, who still lived across the street. She was older now, her hair pure white, her body hunched, but her eyes remained sharp. "You're digging again," she said, when she opened the door, her voice a rasp. "Trying to," Laura admitted. "You must have seen the news." Mrs. Gibbons nodded. "That van buried out there. I knew something like that would come up one day." Laura leaned in. "Why?" The old woman's lips pressed thin. "Because that family didn't just vanish. I heard things. We all did." They sat in the dim living room. Dust floated in the air like ash. "Night they went missing," Mrs. Gibbons began. "I heard shouting. Around midnight, came from their house. A man's voice, angry. Then a slam, like a door breaking." Laura frowned. "Did you report it?" Mrs. Gibbons shook her head. "No one wanted trouble. This street was quiet. People minded their business. Whose voice was it?" Her answer came without hesitation. "Not Michael Whitaker's. Deeper, rougher." Laura's skin prickled. "And then," Mrs. Gibbons continued, lowering her voice, "I saw headlights. Around 2 a.m. A truck, dark, maybe green. It stopped at their house. Someone loaded something heavy in the back. Drove off toward Old Mill Road." Laura's pulse quickened. "You're sure?" "As sure as I am sitting here. I told my husband back then. He said to keep quiet. That whoever was in that truck, they weren't neighbors. They were dangerous." Laura left the house shaken. Why hadn't this surfaced in the original investigation? Was it fear? Or had someone made sure the neighbors stayed quiet? She knocked on other doors. Most brushed her off, too wary to speak. But one man, Mr. Alvarez at the corner, finally gave her something more. "Everyone talks about the truck," he said. "But I remember the little things. The dog. Yeah, the Whitakers had a mutt. Barked at everything. The night they disappeared, it barked nonstop. Then it stopped, just like that. Never heard it again." Laura's throat tightened. "What do you think happened to it?" she asked. Mr. Alvarez met her gaze. "Same thing that happened to them. Back at her apartment, Laura wrote furiously in her notebook, shouting, male voice, not Michael, truck on dark, possibly green, loaded heavy cargo, headed toward Old Mill, dog vanished same night. She pinned these to the board beside the photos of the van. Patterns were forming. The truck, the shouting, the silence that followed. And one thought kept gnawing at her. The Whitakers hadn't just been taken. They'd been hunted. The clue pressed against Laura's mind like a bruise. A dark truck seen in the dead of night, heading toward Old Mill Road. In 1996, records were papers, spotty, and half lost in filing cabinets. But now digitized archives were a detective's lifeline. She spent 2 days at the county records office, her eyes stinging from microfiche screens and scanned ledgers. She searched for truck registrations near Sycamore Lane in the mid-90s. Most entries were unremarkable: Fords, Chevys, beaten-up work vehicles belonging to contractors. But one stood out: green Ford F-150, registered to Thomas Hale. Her stomach clenched at the name. Thomas Hale had been the Whitakers' handyman. He mowed their lawn, fixed leaky faucets, painted the porch railings. He was friendly, forgettable, the kind of man people barely noticed. Laura remembered him vaguely from interviews. A man in his 40s back then, tall, with a limp from an old injury. He'd told police he hadn't seen the Whitakers for weeks before they disappeared. His statement had been routine, buried among dozens. But Mrs. Gibbons had described a truck. Dark, maybe green, heavy cargo loaded at 2 a.m. Now, the connection burned bright. Laura drove out to Hale's last known address. It was a sagging farmhouse on the edge of town, long abandoned. The mailbox leaned crooked, paint peeling. The yard was wild with weeds. She knocked anyway. No answer. Peered through the dusty windows, empty rooms, stripped bare. She circled the property. Out back, in a collapsed barn, she saw the hulking skeleton of a vehicle under a tarp. Her pulse kicked hard. She tugged at the rotted fabric. Beneath it was the rusted husk of a green Ford pickup, its paint dulled by decades, its tires sunk into the dirt. The registration sticker, faded and cracked, read 1996. She called Delaney. "You found his truck?" he asked, incredulous. "I found what's left of it. Same make, same color. Parked in his barn like he meant to bury it." Delaney cursed softly. "Hale's been dead 10 years. Heart attack. If this is his, it's cold as ice." "Maybe not," Laura said. "If the Whitakers were taken in that truck, evidence could still be there. Fibers, blood." Something forensics arrived the next morning. They swarmed the barn, prying open doors, bagging fragments. When the driver's seat was lifted, Laura's breath caught. A faint, dark stain marred the fabric, old, but still visible. Blood. That night, Laura sat in her apartment with the case files spread around her like a storm. She scribbled on her board, "Truck, Hale. Confirmed. Blood on seat. Hale dead. 2010. Why bury the van if he was alive all those years?" It didn't add up. If Hale had taken them, why not destroy everything? Why let the van rot underground? Unless he wasn't working alone. The thought chilled her. Hale might have been a cog in something larger, someone's blunt instrument, and whoever had orchestrated it might still be alive. Thomas Hale's obituary had painted him as a beloved father and respected member of the community. The kind of line families wrote when they didn't know what else to say. Laura drove to the outskirts of town, where his daughter still lived. The house was neat, the yard trimmed, a wind chime clinking in the breeze. Anna Hale opened the door cautiously. Mid-40s now, her hair pulled back, eyes sharp with suspicion. "You're here about my father," she said flatly. "Yes," Laura admitted, It's about the Whitaker case. Anna's shoulders stiffened. I knew it would circle back one day. They sat in the kitchen, the air thick with lemon cleaner. My father wasn't who people thought he was, Anna began, her voice low. He could be kind, sure, but he had shadows, long silences, temper that came out of nowhere. Did he know the Whitakers well? Anna nodded slowly. He worked for them a lot, especially Ellen. She trusted him, said he was reliable. Did he ever take an interest in Sarah or Ben? Laura asked carefully. Anna looked away. I was a teenager back then. I saw things. The way he'd linger when Sarah came outside. How he'd offer to drive her places. Ellen always declined. Thank God. Laura's throat tightened. Did you ever tell anyone? Anna's eyes hardened. Would you have believed me? Back then, he was just the handyman. Nobody wanted to hear that he was off. Anna rose, went to a drawer, and returned with a small box. She placed it between them. I found this after he died. I never showed anyone. Inside were old photographs, edges curling. Some were of houses he'd repaired, barns he'd painted. But tucked in the stack were others, unsettling ones. Children at the park. Not posed, not smiling, just candid shots from a distance. And there, Sarah Whitaker, sitting on a swing, hair blowing across her face, unaware she was being watched. Laura felt her stomach drop. Why didn't you bring this to the police? She whispered. Anna's hands trembled. Because I didn't want my father remembered as a monster. I told myself it was harmless, that maybe he just liked photography. But it wasn't harmless, Laura said, her voice firm. This means he had an eye on her. Maybe all of them. When Laura left the house, the air outside felt too thin. She sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel. The picture of Sarah burned in her mind. A child caught in a predator's lens. She replayed the night of the disappearance, the shouting, the truck, the buried van. Hale's shadow threaded through all of it now. But she couldn't shake one detail. Hale had died before the van was unearthed, which meant someone else had carried the secret forward. The question gnawed at her as she drove home. Had Hale acted alone, or had he been part of something much worse? That night, Laura pinned Sarah's photograph to her board. The eyes of the girl on the swing seemed to stare through her. Help me, they whispered. The next morning, Laura spread Anna Hale's photographs across her desk. Sarah's face haunted her. But it wasn't just Sarah. The other children, unidentified, distant, suggested Hale's camera had roamed far beyond Sycamore Lane. Laura logged into the state's missing persons archive, cross-referencing dates, towns, and faces. Hours bled away, her coffee growing cold. Then she saw it. Catherine Morris, age 10. Disappeared 1992. 2 counties over. Laura held up one of Hale's photos. The girl on the jungle gym. Same striped shirt as the missing poster. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She checked another. Brian Ellis, age 7. Gone 1994. Hale had captured a boy on a bike outside a grocery store. Same dark bowl cut, same gap-toothed grin as the flyer. It wasn't coincidence. Hale hadn't just circled the Whitakers. He'd circled others. Delaney met her at the precinct, jaw tight as she laid out the evidence. Jesus, he muttered, flipping through the photos. This isn't just one family. He was scouting predator, Laura said coldly. Maybe worse. If these kids vanished, Hale was connected. But he wasn't charged. He wasn't even a suspect. Delaney rubbed his temples. Because back then, nobody tied cases across counties. Different departments, different files. No one saw the overlap until now. They sat in silence, the weight of the revelation pressing between them. Finally, Delaney leaned forward. Oh, if Hale's dead, Then someone else carried on. You don't bury a van 20 years later unless you're still guarding the secret. Laura nodded. The thought made her skin crawl. Hale wasn't just a handyman with a temper. He might have been part of something larger, a network. That evening, Laura drove to Old Mill Road again, the site where the van had been pulled from the ground. The earth was scarred now, a wound in the forest. She stood at the edge, listening. The woods hummed with cicadas, but beneath it, she thought she could hear something else, like an echo, the ghost of tires crunching gravel. She closed her eyes and imagined Hale's truck idling here, a man with a limp dragging heavy cargo, but not alone. Someone else helping, someone stronger. The van hadn't been buried by one man. It was too precise, too much work. Laura opened her eyes, the trees looming tall, suffocating. The Whitakers hadn't just vanished. They'd been taken into something deliberate, organized. That night, she scrawled a single word on her board in red marker. Hunting. Because that was what it felt like now. The Whitakers weren't an accident. They were prey. The precinct archive smelled of dust and forgotten stories. Laura sat under the buzz of a flickering light, sifting through brittle manila folders. The Whitaker file was thick, but most of it was the same she'd memorized years ago. Until she found a section stapled awkwardly at the back, pages misaligned, as though someone had slipped them in carelessly. It was a witness statement, unsigned, half-redacted. Tall male, dark jacket, seen near the Whitaker house 2 weeks before disappearance, watching the children play. Vehicle parked half a block away. Not recognized as local. Laura's stomach tightened. She didn't remember this from the original case. She checked the margin. Filed October 3rd, 1996, just 10 days before the vanishing, and stamped across the bottom in faint ink. Suppressed. Do not circulate. She took the pages straight to Delaney. Do you remember this? She asked, spreading them on his kitchen table. He leaned over, squinting. His frown deepened. No. And I was lead investigator on half those interviews. Someone filed it. Then someone buried it. Delaney exhaled sharply. Christ. If we'd known a stranger was stalking the kids. Laura finished the thought for him. We would have looked at Hale differently. Or maybe not Hale at all. The room went quiet. Laura, Delaney said at last. If this was suppressed, it wasn't a mistake. Somebody didn't want this part of the story told. Later, in her apartment, Laura spread the documents across the floor. A stranger. Watching. Driving a vehicle not recognized on Sycamore Lane. She pinned it beside Hale's photo. 2 predators circling the same family. Coincidence? Or collusion? Her eyes burned from staring. She rose to pour water, her mind spiraling. If Hale had been connected to other disappearances, maybe he wasn't alone. Maybe there was a pattern of men, watchers, hunters, operating together, unseen. And someone, somewhere in law enforcement, had chosen silence. At 2 a.m., Laura sat in the dark, her only light the glow of the evidence board. The suppressed reporter hung crooked, as though it didn't want to be there. She whispered aloud, voice trembling, "Who were you?" But the page, like the woods, gave no answer. The signature at the bottom of the suppressed report was faint, almost illegible. But Laura could just make it out. Officer D. Kearns, a name she hadn't spoken in decades. She tracked him down through pension records. He lived in a trailer park on the edge of the county now, retired early, off the grid. Laura drove there on a gray afternoon, rain smearing the windshield. The trailer was small, rust creeping up its sides. A curtain twitched as she parked. When Kearns opened the door, he looked older than his years. Thin, nervous, his eyes darting past her to the empty street. "You shouldn't be here," he said, before she even introduced herself. Inside, the trailer smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke. A muted TV flickered in the corner. Laura laid the report on the table. You filed this, October 3rd, 1996. Witness saw a stranger watching the Whitaker kids. Kern's hands trembled as he lit a cigarette. I remember. Then why was it suppressed? He stared at her, then looked away. Because they told me to bury it. Who? Kearns dragged deep on the cigarette. His voice was barely audible. My sergeant said the witness was unreliable. Said if I kept pushing, I'd regret it. Laura leaned in. Did you believe that? His silence was answer enough. After a long pause, Kearns whispered, I saw the man myself. Not just the witness. A week before they vanished. Tall, watching the Whitaker house from his car. When I drove past, he just smiled at me, like he knew I couldn't touch him. Laura's pulse quickened. Did you run the plates? Kearns shook his head violently. I was told not to. Don't you get it? Some things you weren't supposed to ask about. Some families. Some cases. They weren't meant to be solved. Her stomach turned cold. Are you saying there was a cover-up? I'm saying, Kearns muttered, crushing his cigarette into the ashtray, that the Whitakers weren't the first, and they weren't the last, and the people behind it. He broke off, eyes flicking toward the window. His voice dropped to a whisper. They still watch. Laura left shaken. Rain slicked the pavement, reflecting the trailer park's dim lights. As she climbed into her car, she glanced back at Kearns' window. The curtain twitched again. Not from his hand this time. Someone else was watching. Laura couldn't shake Kearns' words. They still watch. The phrase echoed as she drove through the night, past empty fields and shuttered gas stations. Rain lashed the windshield. She returned to Sycamore Lane, parking beneath the maple tree that had stood sentinel for decades. The Whitaker house loomed, its windows black, its siding peeling. For a moment, it felt as though the house itself was waiting. She sat in the silence, heart hammering. If Hale hadn't acted alone, if there had been others, then perhaps this place wasn't just the scene of a crime. Perhaps it was part of something ongoing, a hunting ground. She stepped out, rain soaking her coat, and walked up the path. The lock on the front door was broken. Vandals had long since stripped the place. Inside, the air smelled of rot and mildew. Floorboards creaked under her weight. She stood in the kitchen, where the Whitakers' last meal had cooled untouched. She imagined Ellen's hands setting the table, Daniel folding the paper, Sarah laughing, Michael dribbling his basketball outside, gone in an instant, and replaced by silence. Her flashlight beam swept the hallway, catching faint scratches on the doorframe. She knelt, tracing them with her fingers, numbers carved into the wood. 312. Her pulse spiked. She checked her notebook. On the suppressed report, the partial license plate described by the witness had read 312K. The scratches weren't random. Someone had marked it here. Laura's breath fogged the air. The Whitakers hadn't just been taken. They'd been claimed. A sound drifted from upstairs. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Laura froze, listening. The boards above creaked, then fell silent. Her flashlight trembled in her hand. She forced herself to climb the stairs, each step groaning under her weight. At the landing, the air grew colder. She swept the beam across the hall. Empty bedrooms, bare walls. But in Sarah's old room, the light caught something. Pinned to the wall was a single photograph. Fresh, glossy. Laura's throat closed. It was of her, taken from across the street, standing outside the house the night before, staring at the windows. Her hand shook as she pulled the photo down. The paper was damp, smudged at the edges, but the image was clear. They were still watching. Not Hale, not the past. Now. A door slammed downstairs. Laura spun, heart pounding. But when she reached the bottom, the house was empty. The front door hung open, rain slashing through. She stood in the doorway, clutching the photograph, the storm soaking her. The truth pressed in on her from all sides. The Whitakers hadn't simply disappeared. They had been taken by something that did not stop. Something that watched, waited, and chose. And now, it had chosen her. Months later, the case files were boxed again, stored away in the precinct basement. The excavation site at Old Mill Road was fenced off, but children still whispered about it, daring each other to sneak inside. The Whitaker house finally sold, cheap. The new family painted the siding, fixed the shutters, planted flowers. Neighbors smiled, pretending the past had been washed away. But at night, when the street grew quiet, a dark vehicle sometimes idled at the end of the cul-de-sac. Headlights off, engine low, watching, just as it always had.